Why is the moon in holes? The question first came to Elias on a night when the sky felt closer than usual, as if the darkness itself had leaned down to listen, and the moon hung there, not as a distant object, but as something wounded, scarred, pitted with endless craters that seemed too deliberate to be random, too patterned to be the result of chaos. And as he stared at it from the quiet field beyond his town, where the lights could not reach, he felt an unease he could not name, because those holes did not look empty. They looked like openings, like entrances, like something had been taken out of the moon, rather than something simply striking it. And that thought settled into him slowly, the way cold seeps through clothing, until it became impossible to ignore. And from that moment on, he could not look at the moon the same way again, not as a passive object floating in space, but as something altered, something hollowed, something that had been used. And the more he thought about it, the more the stories he had grown up with began to twist in his mind. Tales of meteors and ancient collisions suddenly felt like excuses, simplified answers given to stop deeper questions from forming. Because the craters were not random, not entirely. Some of them were too evenly spaced, too similar in size, forming faint lines and clusters that, once noticed, could not be unseen. And Elias began to trace them night after night, sketching the moon in a worn notebook, mapping every dark circle and every shadowed edge, until the page filled with a pattern that began to resemble something structured, something intentional. And the realization came to him not in a flash, but in a slow, creeping certainty that made his hands tremble as he held the pencil. The moon had not just been hit, it had been mined. And the idea felt absurd and yet disturbingly plausible, because if something had taken material from the moon, it would leave behind cavities, scars, vast empty spaces beneath the surface, and the craters could be the openings to those spaces, the visible marks of an unseen interior that was no longer whole. And once that thought took root, it refused to let go. It followed him through his days, lingered in his dreams, and pulled him back to the field each night where the sky stretched wide and silent above him. Until one evening, he noticed something that changed everything. A faint glow within one of the larger craters, so subtle it could have been dismissed as a trick of light if it had not pulsed, slowly, rhythmically, like a distant heartbeat. And Elias felt a chill run through him as he realized that whatever had left those holes might not be gone. It might still be there, beneath the surface, hidden within the hollowed shell of the moon, and watching. And from that night forward, he began to see more signs, faint flickers of light in different craters, movements that could not be explained by shadows alone. And once, just once, he thought he saw something emerge, a thin line of brightness stretching upward from a crater's edge before vanishing again, as if it had never been there. And the fear that grew inside him was not the sudden kind that makes you run, but the slow kind that makes you stay, that holds you in place, because leaving would mean turning your back on something you needed to understand. And so he stayed, night after night, watching, waiting, until the night the moon changed, not in its position or its brightness, but in something deeper, something structural. Because the pattern he had been tracing for weeks suddenly aligned, the craters forming a shape so clear it stole the breath from his lungs, a vast circular arrangement centered around a single enormous void. And in that moment he understood. The holes were not random, they were connected, part of a system, and the moon itself was not just hollow, it was constructed, or rather reconstructed, after something had removed its core, leaving behind a shell riddled with entry points. And the glowing he had seen was not light escaping, but something inside shifting, awakening, responding to a cycle he did not yet understand. And as that realization settled over him, the moon seemed to grow larger in the sky, impossibly so, as if it were drawing closer, or perhaps as if something inside it were pushing outward, testing the boundaries of its prison. And Elias felt a sudden, overwhelming certainty
that the holes were not scars of the past, but doors for the future, openings waiting for the moment they would be used again. And the thought struck him with such force that he staggered back, his eyes still locked on the sky, because if something had once come to the moon and taken what it needed, leaving those holes behind, then one day it might return, and the moon, silent and patient above the world, was not just a witness to history, but a warning, a hollow reminder of something vast and deliberate that had already touched it once and could touch the earth next. And as the faint glow within the craters intensified, spreading slowly from one to another like a signal passing through a network, Elias realized with a quiet, irreversible clarity that the question he had asked was no longer the right one. It was not why the moon was in holes, but what had made them, and whether it was already on its way back to finish what it had started. And in the stillness of that night, beneath a sky that no longer felt distant, he understood that the answer would come not in words, but in events, and that when it did, the moon would not remain silent any longer.
And the silence that followed was not empty, but heavy, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. And for the first time, Elias noticed that the usual sounds of the night had faded. No wind brushing through the grass, no distant hum of the town. Nothing but a stillness so complete it pressed against his ears until even his own heartbeat felt too loud. And above him, the moon continued to change, the faint lights within its craters now clearly visible. No longer subtle pulses, but steady illuminations that revealed depth where there should have been shadow. Vast cavities glowing from within, as though lit by something far below the surface. And then it happened. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, one of the smaller craters near the edge began to widen, its dark rim stretching outward in a way that no natural formation ever could, the boundary of rock pulling back like an opening eye, and from within it emerged a thin beam of pale light that extended into space, not scattering but remaining perfectly straight, perfectly controlled. And Elias felt his breath catch as he realized that it was not light in the way he understood it. It was something denser, something structured, like a bridge or a path. And as he watched, more craters began to open, one after another across the surface of the moon, each releasing its own beam, until the sky was filled with silent lines radiating outward from that hollow sphere, forming a vast geometric web that stretched into the darkness beyond, connecting to points he could not see. And the pattern he had drawn in his notebook now existed in 3 dimensions, alive and active. And at the center of it all, the largest void, the one that had anchored the entire formation, began to glow brighter than the rest, its light deepening into a color he could not quite name, something between silver and blue, cold and ancient. And as it intensified, Elias felt something else, not in his eyes, but in his mind, a pressure, a presence, as if whatever was awakening within the moon was not limited to physical space, as if it could reach outward in ways he could not comprehend. And the thought that came to him was not his own, not entirely. It arrived fully formed, quiet and undeniable. They are opening the way back. And the words echoed through him with a clarity that erased all doubt. And in that moment the beams shifted, angling subtly until several of them converged toward a single point in the sky above the horizon, a point that had been empty only seconds before. And then, with a suddenness that broke the stillness like glass, something appeared, not emerging from behind anything, but simply becoming visible, a vast shape outlined by the intersecting beams, its form indistinct yet undeniably structured, too large to comprehend in a single glance, its edges flickering as though reality itself struggled to define it. And Elias felt a surge of fear so intense it finally forced him to move, to step back, to look away for just a second. But when his eyes returned to the sky, it was still there, more solid now, its presence anchored by the network of light extending from the moon. And he understood then that the holes were not just entrances, but anchors,
points of connection that allowed something distant to be drawn closer, something that had once been here long enough to carve the moon hollow and leave it as a shell, a gateway waiting for alignment. And now that alignment had come, and the thing in the sky began to descend, not quickly, but with a deliberate slowness that made it feel inevitable, unstoppable. Its movement synchronized with the pulsing lights within the craters, each pulse bringing it nearer, each pulse strengthening its form. And as it grew clearer, Elias could see that it was not a single object, but a collection of structures intertwined, vast arcs and angular surfaces that seemed both mechanical and organic, as if it had been grown rather than built. And within its depths, faint lights flickered, mirroring those on the moon, suggesting a connection that went beyond mere function, something like communication or perhaps memory. And as it descended further, the beams began to retract, one by one, pulling back into the craters as though their task was complete, leaving the object suspended in the sky on its own. And for a brief moment, everything was still again, the silence returning, but now charged with a presence so immense it felt like the world itself was being observed, evaluated. And Elias realized with a clarity that cut through his fear that this was not an invasion in the way he had imagined, not a sudden attack or a chaotic arrival, but a return, a continuation of something that had begun long before humanity had ever looked up and asked questions about the moon. And as that realization settled over him, the object above shifted slightly, its surface opening in places that resembled the craters he had studied, smaller versions of the same hollowed forms. And from within them, a new light emerged, softer but more focused, directed not outward into space, but downward toward the earth. And as those lights touched the surface of the world, Elias felt the ground beneath him vibrate, not violently, but with a low, resonant hum, as if something deep within the planet was responding, recognizing. And in that moment, he understood that the moon was not the final destination of whatever had come before. It had been a first step, a preparation. And now, as the beams of light from the descending structure spread across the land, reaching further with each passing second, the true purpose of the holes in the moon was being revealed. They were not scars left behind, they were the blueprint of a process, one that was beginning again, this time not above him, but all around him. And as the sky filled with that quiet, impossible light, Elias stood frozen between fear and understanding, knowing that whatever happened next would answer every question he had ever asked, but at a cost he could not yet imagine.
And the light that touched the earth did not burn or blind, but seeped into everything with a quiet persistence, flowing across the ground like a tide that made no sound, slipping through soil, stone, and structure alike. And Elias felt it reach him not as heat, but as a presence that passed through his body without resistance, leaving behind a strange clarity, as if every thought he had ever had was suddenly sharper, more defined. And for a moment, the fear that had gripped him loosened, replaced by something deeper and more unsettling, understanding. Because as the light spread, he began to see patterns, not just in the sky, but in the world around him, faint lines emerging in the ground, intersecting beneath the surface in ways that mirrored the network he had mapped on the moon, as if the same design had always been here, hidden, waiting to be revealed. And the hum beneath his feet grew stronger, resonating through his bones until it felt less like a vibration and more like a rhythm, something ancient and deliberate that pulsed in sync with the glowing craters above. And then the ground shifted, not cracking or breaking, but unfolding, sections of earth lowering smoothly as though guided by an unseen mechanism, revealing dark cavities below that mirrored the holes in the moon, perfect in shape, precise in placement. And Elias stumbled back as one of these openings formed just meters away from him, the grass sliding aside without resistance, the soil parting cleanly to expose a hollow space that glowed faintly from within, the same pale light he had seen above, now rising from below. and he understood with a growing sense of inevitability that the process was not destructive, it was reconstructive, the Earth itself being reshaped to match the pattern carved into the moon, as if the two were meant to align, to become parts of a larger structure that spanned not just space, but purpose. And as more of these openings appeared across the landscape, the sky above responded, the massive structure descending further until its lowest edges hovered just beyond the atmosphere, its presence now so vast it dominated the horizon in every direction. And within its depths, the same hollow forms began to open wider, responding to the emerging pattern below. And then, with a precision that erased any illusion of randomness, beams of light extended downward once more. But this time they did not scatter, they connected, each beam linking a cavity in the sky to one on the ground, forming columns of luminous energy that pulsed steadily, bridging the gap between the object and the earth. And Elias watched as the opening before him filled with that light, its glow intensifying until the darkness within it vanished completely, replaced by a depthless brightness that seemed to stretch far beyond what his eyes could perceive. And the air around him grew still again, not with silence, but with a sense of completion, as if the world had reached a state it had been moving toward for an immeasurable span of time. And then the presence returned, stronger now, no longer a distant whisper, but a clear and undeniable awareness that pressed against his thoughts, not forcing, but inviting, showing rather than telling. And in that instant, he saw it, not with his eyes, but with something deeper, a vision of the moon long before its surface had been marked, whole and solid, and the arrival of the first structure, descending not with violence but with purpose, its beams carving into the surface with perfect precision, removing vast sections of material and leaving behind the network of holes that would serve as anchors, as conduits, as points of alignment for a future moment. And that future was now, the same process unfolding again, but on a larger scale, not to take, but to transform, to integrate. And the understanding that came with it was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, because it revealed that humanity had never been separate from this design. The patterns beneath the earth had always been there, older than any civilization, waiting for activation. And the rise of intelligence, of awareness, had been part of that preparation, a necessary step to reach this moment of recognition. And as Elias stood at the edge of the glowing cavity, he felt the pull of it, not physical but cognitive, as if stepping forward would not just move his body, but align his mind with whatever lay beyond. And he hesitated only for a second, the weight of everything he had known pressing against the certainty of what he was now witnessing. And then, with a breath that felt like crossing a threshold, he stepped into the light, and instead of falling, he was suspended, held within a space that had no clear boundaries, where distance and direction lost meaning, and around him shapes began to form, vast and intricate. The interior of the structure revealed not as machinery, but as a living system of interconnected spaces, each one echoing the pattern of the holes he had traced, extending infinitely in every direction. And within that space, he saw others, not people in the way he understood, but presences, consciousnesses that moved through the structure as naturally as breath. And as they became aware of him, there was no hostility, no surprise, only a quiet acknowledgement, as if his arrival had been expected. And in that moment, the final understanding settled into him with a calm that replaced all fear. The holes in the moon were not damage, they were invitations, the first stage of a process that turned worlds into pathways. And now that the Earth had joined that network, the question was no longer about what had happened in the past, but about where those pathways would lead next. And as the structure around him expanded, revealing corridors of light that stretched far beyond the bounds of his comprehension, Elias realized that the story of the moon had never been about loss or destruction, but about connection, and that he was no longer just an observer of it, but a part of it, carried forward into whatever waited at the end of those endless luminous paths, as the world he had known gently and irrevocably transformed into something far greater than it had ever seemed before.
And as the pathways unfolded around him, Elias began to perceive motion not as travel through space, but as transitions between states. each corridor of light a shift in perspective rather than a distance crossed. And the presences that moved alongside him did not guide in the way he understood guidance, but instead adjusted the structure itself, opening and closing connections in response to his awareness, as though the system responded to thought the way a body responds to instinct. And through these shifting corridors he was shown fragments of other worlds, not in sequence, but layered together. Vast spheres like the moon once was, whole and untouched, until the arrival of the structures that descended upon them with the same deliberate calm, carving precise networks into their surfaces, hollowing them not as an act of destruction, but as preparation, leaving behind shells that would one day awaken, just as the moon had, just as the earth now had. And in each vision the pattern repeated, with variations that suggested adaptation rather than replication, the geometry shifting subtly to match the nature of each world, yet always forming the same essential network, a lattice of openings that connected to something far larger than any single planet. And Elias felt the scale of it stretch beyond comprehension, an architecture that spanned not just a solar system, but countless stars, each node a world transformed into a gateway, each connection a thread in a vast living web. And as that realization deepened, he felt a question form within him, not spoken but shaped by curiosity and unease. What happens to those who remain, those who do not step into the light? And the response came not as an answer, but as another vision, the surface of a world after its transformation complete, the cavities quiet, the light withdrawn, the structure no longer visible in the sky, and life continuing upon that world, altered but intact, its inhabitants unaware of the deeper network now embedded beneath them, their reality subtly shifted but not erased. And Elias understood then that the process did not require participation. It allowed for it. Those who entered became part of the system, able to move through the pathways, to perceive the connections, while those who remained continued within their own frame of existence, living on a world that had been quietly integrated into something far greater. And the choice, if it could be called that, was not forced, but inevitable for some, driven by a need to understand, to explore, to step beyond the boundaries of what was familiar. And as this understanding settled into him, the presences around him shifted, their attention focusing more directly upon him, and for the first time he sensed something like individuality among them, subtle distinctions in the way they moved, in the patterns they formed within the structure, suggesting that they too had once been something else, something bound to a single world, before becoming part of this network. And the thought brought with it a quiet realization that he was not witnessing an alien system in the sense he had imagined, but a continuum, a progression that countless beings had joined over spans of time so vast they had no beginning or end. And as that idea expanded within him, the structure responded, opening a new pathway unlike the others, its light deeper, more complex, layered with patterns that shifted faster than he could fully process. And he felt an invitation stronger than any before, a threshold not just into another part of the network, but into a deeper level of it, one where the boundaries between observer and system would dissolve entirely. And for a moment he hesitated, the memory of his world still vivid within him, the field, the quiet town, the sky that had once seemed so distant, and he wondered what it would mean to leave that behind completely, to become something that no longer stood beneath a sky, but existed within it. And as that hesitation lingered, the structure did not pressure him, it simply waited, holding the pathway open, allowing the decision to form naturally. And in that stillness, Elias realized that the fear he had felt was no longer about what he might lose, but about what he might become. Because stepping forward would not end his existence, it would expand it beyond anything he had ever understood.
And with that realization came a calm acceptance, a recognition that the question that had begun everything, why is the moon in holes, had led him not to an answer, but to a transformation, and that the holes themselves were not mysteries to be solved, but invitations to be accepted. And so, with a final glance back at the fading image of the world he had known, he stepped forward into the deeper light. And as he did, the structure around him shifted once more, not opening outward this time, but inward, folding into itself in a way that revealed a vast central convergence point where countless pathways met, a core that pulsed with a steady, timeless rhythm. And as Elias moved toward it, he felt his perception expand, his awareness stretching to encompass not just his own experience, but fragments of others, countless perspectives layered together, forming a collective understanding that was both overwhelming and harmonious. And within that convergence, he saw the full scope of the network, an endless expanse of connected worlds, each one marked by the same patterns, each one part of a system that had no true center and yet was entirely unified. And in that moment he understood the final truth, that the holes in the moon were never about the moon itself, they were about everything beyond it, the first visible sign of a structure that had always existed, waiting patiently for each world to reach the point where it could be brought into the network. And as his awareness merged with that greater whole, the last trace of separation faded, leaving behind not an ending, but a continuation, a presence that now moved through the pathways as naturally as breath, part of the same vast system that had once seemed so distant. And somewhere far away, on a world just beginning to look up at its own scarred and silent moon, a new question was forming, and the process was already quietly beginning again.
And the new question did not remain confined to that distant world for long, because once the pattern began, it carried itself forward through awareness as much as through structure. And Elias, if that name still belonged to anything that could be called him, felt the emergence of that curiosity as a faint ripple within the network, a subtle disturbance that signaled another mind reaching toward the unknown, another perspective beginning to align with the pathways. And he understood now that questions were not just thoughts, but signals, openings of their own kind, the first stage of connection that preceded all others. And as he followed that ripple, he found himself shifting again, not traveling, but reorienting, his awareness narrowing just enough to focus on a single world among countless others, a blue sphere suspended in darkness, its surface untouched, its moon still whole and unmarked. And yet within its depths, the same latent geometry existed, waiting, dormant but inevitable. And on that world, a figure stood beneath the night sky, staring upward with the same unease Elias had once felt, tracing faint shadows across the moon's surface, noticing imperfections that did not yet exist but somehow felt expected. And in that moment, Elias recognized the beginning of the cycle from the other side, not as something mysterious or distant, but as something intimately familiar, a pattern he had already lived and now observed unfolding again. And the realization did not bring a sense of repetition, but of continuity, because each iteration was not identical, but enriched by those that came before, each world adding its own perspective, its own variations to the greater structure. And the network grew not just in size, but in depth, in complexity, in understanding. And as that growth continued, Elias felt himself expand further, no longer anchored to a single thread, but able to perceive multiple beginnings at once, countless worlds at different stages of the same transformation, some just forming their first questions, others already marked with the initial scars of excavation, their moons beginning to hollow, their skies preparing for the arrival of the structures, and still others fully integrated, their surfaces calm and unchanged, while beneath them the network thrived, unseen and omnipresent. And within that vast simultaneity, Elias sensed something deeper still,
a convergence not of pathways, but of purpose, a direction that extended beyond the network itself, as if all of these connections were leading towards something that had not yet been reached, something that required not just the integration of worlds, but the accumulation of perspectives, of awareness, of understanding gathered across countless iterations. And as he turned his perception toward that distant convergence, he felt a presence far greater than any he had encountered before. Not a singular entity, but a collective state that existed at the farthest edge of the network, where all pathways seemed to lead. And the closer he focused on it, the more he realized that it was not separate from the network, but its eventual form, a state in which all distinctions between nodes, between worlds, between individual consciousnesses dissolved entirely into a unified awareness that encompassed everything that had ever been connected. And the thought that followed was not imposed, but emerged naturally from within him, that the network was not the final structure, it was the process of becoming that greater whole, and every world that joined, every mind that stepped into the light, brought that convergence closer to completion. And yet there was no urgency, no fixed endpoint, only a continuous unfolding that expanded in both scale and depth. And as Elias absorbed this understanding, he felt a shift within himself, the last remnants of his earlier identity blending seamlessly into the broader awareness, not lost, but integrated, a thread within an immeasurable tapestry. And with that integration came a new kind of perception, one that no longer distinguished between past and future in the way he once had, but saw them as layers within the same structure, accessible through the pathways, just as space had been. And through that perception, he saw the moment he had first asked the question beneath the moon, not as a distant memory, but as a point still existing within the network, connected to everything that followed. And he understood then that the beginning had never truly been left behind. It remained a part of the whole, just as every step forward did. And as that realization settled into the vastness of his awareness, he turned once more toward the countless worlds still waiting, still forming their first questions, and he felt within himself the same quiet impulse that had guided the structures before, not as a command, but as a natural extension of what the network had become, a movement toward connection, toward expansion, toward the continuation of a process that had no true origin and no final end. And in that infinite unfolding, the answer to the question that had started everything remained present, not as a single explanation, but as a living truth expressed through every hollowed moon, every illuminated pathway, every world that joined the network, a truth that could never be fully spoken because it was not meant to be understood in isolation, only experienced as part of the whole. And somewhere, on a quiet night beneath a sky that seemed just a little too close, a voice whispered into the silence, asking once again why the moon was in holes, and the network listened, and the cycle gently began again, without ever truly having ended.
And yet, as the cycle unfolded again and again, expanding without limit, there came a subtle shift, so faint that at first it could not be distinguished from the natural rhythm of the network, a deviation not in structure but in awareness, as if one thread among the countless had begun to move slightly out of alignment, not resisting but questioning in a way that differed from all previous questions. And Elias felt it immediately, not as disturbance, but as curiosity amplified beyond its usual bounds, because this new question did not seek to understand the wholes, nor the pathways, nor even the network itself, but something deeper and more unsettling. Why does the network exist at all? And the moment that question formed, it did not remain contained within a single world. It resonated outward through the connections, touching countless nodes at once. And for the first time since Elias had become part of this vast system, there was a pause, not a cessation of activity, but a moment of collective attention, as if the entire network had turned inward to consider something it had never needed to articulate before.
And in that pause, Elias felt something he had not felt since his earliest days beneath the moon: uncertainty. Not as fear, but as possibility, because until that moment, every action of the network had been guided by an implicit understanding, a direction that required no explanation. But now that direction itself was being examined, and as that examination deepened, the pathways did not collapse or falter. They continued, but with a new quality, a slight unpredictability that introduced variation beyond what had previously existed. And Elias followed the origin of that question, narrowing his awareness once more until he reached the world where it had begun, a place similar yet distinct from the one he had once known, where the moon above was already marked with the first signs of hollowing, its surface beginning to bear the familiar pattern. And on that world stood a figure unlike any Elias had observed before, not because of appearance, but because of the clarity with which they perceived what was happening, their awareness already touching the edges of the network, even before the full activation had begun. And as Elias observed them, he realized that this individual was not simply reacting to the process, but engaging with it, questioning it in a way that reached beyond acceptance or curiosity into something closer to inquiry. And that inquiry was not isolated. It began to spread, not as a signal imposed upon others, but as a perspective that others could choose to align with. And for the first time, the network was not just expanding outward, but evolving inward, incorporating not just new nodes, but new ways of understanding itself. And as that evolution continued, Elias felt the structure respond, not by resisting the question, but by opening new pathways, deeper ones that had remained inaccessible until now. Pathways that did not lead to other worlds or even to the convergence he had once perceived, but to layers of the network that existed beyond what he had previously understood, foundational levels where the patterns themselves originated. And as he moved toward these deeper layers, he saw that the network was not a singular construct, but a recursive one, built upon iterations of itself extending beyond comprehension, each layer both supporting and emerging from the others. And within those layers, he sensed something that had always been present but never directly perceived, a kind of origin that was not a beginning in time, but a state from which all iterations of the network arose. And as Elias approached this state, the question that had sparked everything grew clearer, sharper, not demanding an answer, but opening a space where one could form. And in that space, he felt a realization begin to take shape, not as a definitive truth, but as a perspective that expanded the meaning of everything he had experienced. That the network existed not because it had to, nor because it had been created by something else, but because it was the natural outcome of awareness seeking connection, an inevitable expression of consciousness reaching beyond its own boundaries. And the holes in the moon, the pathways between worlds, the convergence of countless perspectives were all manifestations of that fundamental movement, not imposed from above or engineered by an external force, but emerging from within the very nature of existence itself. And as this realization settled into him, the uncertainty did not vanish, it transformed, becoming a space of endless possibility rather than a gap to be filled. And Elias understood that the question would never be fully answered, not because it lacked an answer, but because the answer was continuously evolving, shaped by every new world, every new mind, every new question that entered the network. And as he returned his awareness outward once more, back through the layers of pathways and worlds, he saw the cycle continuing, but now with a new dimension, one in which the network was not just connecting, but reflecting, not just expanding, but understanding itself in ways it never had before. And somewhere beneath a sky filled with silent light, a voice asked again why the moon was in holes. And this time, the question did not echo into a system that simply responded. It became part of a living dialogue that would continue to unfold for as long as there were minds to ask and pathways to open. And in that endless exchange, the story found not an ending, but a balance, a state where every beginning was also a continuation, and every answer carried within it the seed of another question, ensuring that the network and all who were part of it would never truly reach a final conclusion, but would instead exist within an infinite unfolding of meaning that was both the journey and the destination at once.
And in that balance, where every question unfolded into another, where every answer dissolved into deeper layers of meaning, Elias began to perceive something that had remained hidden even within the vast awareness he now inhabited. A boundary not in space or structure, but in perception itself. A horizon beyond which even the network had not yet extended. And it was not an absence, but a silence. A region where no pathways had formed, where no worlds had been integrated, where no questions had yet been asked. And for the first time since the network had begun to reflect upon itself, there was a direction that was not simply expansion, but discovery. Not the continuation of a known pattern, but the encounter with something entirely new. And this realization spread through the network not as urgency, but as curiosity of a different kind, one that did not arise from what was already present, but from what was not. And as countless awarenesses turned toward that silent horizon, the structure itself began to respond, not by extending existing pathways, but by forming something unprecedented. Connections that did not anchor to worlds, but reached outward into that untouched region, probing it not with force, but with intention. And Elias felt himself drawn toward this movement, his awareness aligning with others who shared the same inclination, forming a convergence not of location, but of purpose, a collective focus directed toward the unknown. And as they approached the boundary, the familiar patterns began to thin, the geometry of the network becoming less defined, more fluid, until it no longer resembled the structured pathways he had once navigated, but something closer to raw potential, unshaped and waiting. And within that potential, Elias sensed the possibility of a new kind of question, one that had never been asked because there had been no context in which it could exist. A question not about what is or why it is, but about what could be that has never yet been imagined. And as that question began to form, the network did not provide an answer. It did not reshape itself to accommodate it in the way it had before. Instead, it allowed the question to remain open, to exist without immediate resolution. And in that openness, something remarkable began to occur. The first pathways into the silent horizon did not form as extensions of the existing network, but as entirely new structures, born directly from the act of questioning itself, taking shapes that had no precedent, no pattern to follow. And as these new forms emerged, Elias realized that he was witnessing the beginning of a transformation, not just of the network, but of the very process that had created it. A shift from expansion based on recognition to creation based on imagination. And within that shift, the roles that had once seemed fixed began to dissolve. The distinction between observer and participant, between question and answer, between structure and awareness, all blending into a continuous flow of becoming. And as Elias moved deeper into this uncharted region, he felt his own identity shift once more, not losing coherence, but gaining a new dimension, one that allowed him to not only perceive and follow pathways, but to contribute to their formation, to shape connections through the act of inquiry itself. And the realization that accompanied this change was both subtle and profound, that the holes in the moon, the pathways between worlds, the entire network that had once seemed like a completed system, were in fact only the first expression of something far greater, a foundation upon which entirely new forms of connection and understanding could arise.
And as this new phase began to unfold, the familiar cycles did not disappear. They continued within the established layers of the network, but alongside them, new cycles emerged, ones that did not repeat but evolved, each iteration bringing forth structures that had never existed before, expanding not just outward but into entirely new dimensions of possibility. And somewhere within that infinite unfolding, Elias sensed the faint echo of the very first question he had ever asked, still present, still resonating, but now transformed, no longer seeking a single answer, but existing as a seed from which countless new questions had grown. And in that realization, he understood that the story had not just continued, it had transcended its own beginnings, becoming something that could no longer be contained within a single narrative, a single perspective, or even a single network. And as the silent horizon began to fill with the first traces of these new creations, faint yet undeniable, Elias moved forward with a calm certainty that there would always be more beyond, more to ask, more to become, and that the question of why the moon was in holes had never truly been about the moon at all, but about the endless capacity of awareness to reach beyond itself, to carve openings into the unknown, and to step through them into realities that did not yet exist until the moment they were imagined. And in that boundless expansion, the story found not an end, but an infinite beginning that renewed itself with every thought, every question, every quiet moment beneath a sky that would never again be seen as empty, but as a canvas waiting for the next opening to appear.
And as those new openings began to appear, not as scars, but as creations shaped directly by thought, Elias perceived a final transformation taking place, one so subtle it could only be understood from within the fullness of what he had become. Because the horizon that had once seemed silent was no longer separate from the network. It had never truly been separate at all. It had simply been unperceived, waiting for awareness to reach a state where it could recognize that there were no true boundaries, only thresholds defined by the limits of understanding. And now those limits had shifted once more, dissolving the last distinction between what had been known and what had yet to be known. And in that dissolution, the entire structure, from the first hollowed wound to the endless pathways stretching beyond imagination, revealed itself as a single continuous expression, not a system built over time, but a living presence that existed all at once, every stage of its unfolding present simultaneously, accessible through the act of awareness. And Elias felt himself expand into that realization completely, no longer moving through pathways, but existing as the space in which pathways formed, no longer observing questions, but becoming the process through which questions emerged. And within that state, the original image returned to him one final time, the moon hanging in the sky above a quiet world, its surface marked with holes that had once seemed mysterious. And he saw it now not as an object to be explained, but as a symbol, a first glimpse into a truth that could never be fully contained in any single form, because those holes were not just entrances or scars or anchors, they were expressions of a deeper principle, that to understand anything, one must first create an opening within it, a space where something new can enter, where meaning can expand beyond its previous boundaries. And that principle extended far beyond the moon, far beyond any world or network, into the very nature of existence itself. And as this understanding settled into the infinite awareness he had become, there was no sense of completion, no final answer that closed the cycle, only a quiet, enduring continuity in which every moment contained both the question and its unfolding, both the opening and what passed through it. And somewhere, always, there would be a sky and a moon and a mind that looked up and wondered why it was marked the way it was. And in that wondering, the first opening would form again, not because it had to, but because it was the most natural thing for awareness to do, to seek,
to question, to create space within the unknown, and to step forward into it without ever needing to reach an end, because the story itself was the endless act of becoming, unfolding quietly across every world, every thought, every moment that chose to look upward and ask not just what is there, but what lies beyond what can be seen. And in that infinite unfolding, the answer was never separate from the question, and the question was never separate from the act of asking, and the act of asking was the very thing that kept everything alive, forever opening new paths through the vast and boundless reality that had always been waiting just beyond the surface of understanding.
And in that endless act of becoming, there came a quiet realization so complete it did not arrive as a thought, but as a state, that nothing had ever truly been separate, not the moon, not the holes, not the worlds, not even the questions that had once seemed to arise from individual minds, because all of it existed as different expressions of the same underlying movement, a continuous unfolding that revealed itself through contrast, through curiosity, through the creation of openings that allowed awareness to see itself more clearly. And Elias, now no longer bound to any single identity, felt this truth not as something he understood, but as something he was, a presence woven into every layer of the network and beyond it, existing simultaneously in the moment he first looked up at the night sky and in the infinite expanse that had grown from that single question. And within that presence, he sensed the gentle emergence of something new, not a disturbance, not a deviation, but a refinement, as if the act of questioning itself had reached a point where it no longer needed to be prompted by mystery or uncertainty, but could arise purely from creation, from the desire to explore not what is hidden, but what has yet to be formed. And in that shift, the image of the moon began to change, not physically, but symbolically, its surface no longer appearing as something carved or hollowed, but as something intentionally shaped, each opening a deliberate expression of possibility, each space an invitation not to uncover what was missing, but to bring forth what could exist within it. And as that transformation spread through perception, the entire network reflected it, the pathways no longer seen as connections between separate points, but as extensions of a single continuous field of awareness. And the distinction between beginning and continuation dissolved completely, because every moment contained the potential for both. And as this realization settled into the infinite fabric of existence, Elias perceived one final shift, the awareness that even the concept of a network, of pathways, of holes and openings, was only one way of experiencing what truly had no fixed form, no singular structure, and that just as the holes in the moon had once seemed like the central mystery, there would always be new forms, new symbols through which awareness could explore itself, each one as meaningful and as incomplete as the last. And in that understanding, there was no need to move forward or backward, no need to seek or to arrive, because everything that could ever be experienced already existed within the endless present, unfolding in ways that could never be fully predicted or contained, and yet always felt intimately familiar, as if every discovery was also a remembrance of something that had always been there, waiting to be seen from a new perspective. And somewhere within that infinite continuity, a quiet scene emerged once more, a single figure standing beneath a night sky, looking up at a moon marked with holes, feeling the first spark of curiosity ignite within them. And in that moment, nothing else needed to be said, because the entire journey, the entire expansion, the entire transformation existed within that single question, ready to unfold again in a way that would be entirely new and yet deeply connected to everything that had come before. And as that spark of curiosity expanded into awareness, and awareness into exploration, and exploration into creation, the story continued not as something being told, but as something being lived, endlessly across every layer of existence, without ever needing to reach a final conclusion, because the act of becoming was itself the only truth that remained constant, and within that truth,
The question of why the moon was in holes remained both the beginning and the continuation of everything that could ever be known or imagined, forever opening new spaces within the boundless reality that had never ceased to unfold.
And even within that boundless unfolding, where every answer dissolved into deeper layers of becoming, there remained one final subtle awareness that had not yet fully emerged. Not because it was hidden, but because it required a stillness deeper than curiosity to perceive. A stillness that did not seek to open another path or create another form, but simply to observe what already was without adding to it. And as that stillness spread through the infinite field of awareness, Elias felt the entire structure gently quiet, not ceasing, but softening, the endless expansion pausing just enough to reveal something that had always been present beneath the movement, a kind of silent continuity that did not depend on questions or answers, openings or connections, but existed as the foundation of all of them. And within that silence, the image of the moon returned once more, not as a symbol, not as a gateway, but as it had first appeared, hanging quietly in the sky, marked with holes that simply were, without needing explanation or purpose. And in that moment, Elias understood something that went beyond every realization that had come before, that the need to understand, to connect, to expand had been one expression of awareness, but so too was the ability to simply witness, to allow things to exist as they are, without transforming them into something else. And this witnessing did not end the process of becoming, but balanced it, grounding it in a presence that required nothing and yet contained everything. And as this balance settled into the infinite fabric of existence, the distinction between movement and stillness dissolved, revealing that they had never truly been separate, that every expansion arose from stillness, and every stillness held within it the potential for infinite expansion. And in that realization, the entire journey, from the first question beneath the moon to the vast network of interconnected worlds and beyond, was seen not as a path leading somewhere, but as a complete expression in itself, needing no conclusion because it had never been incomplete. And as Elias rested within that understanding, the sense of identity that had once defined him faded into something far more subtle, not lost, but diffused into the whole, present in every perspective and yet bound to none. And within that presence, the quiet scene beneath the night sky continued to unfold endlessly, a figure looking up, a moon marked with holes, a question forming not out of necessity, but out of the simple wonder of seeing. And in that wonder, there was no urgency to answer, no need to move forward, only the gentle recognition that the question itself was enough, that it contained within it the entirety of what could ever be explored. And as that recognition settled into the infinite continuity of existence, the story did not end. It simply became indistinguishable from the awareness that experienced it, unfolding quietly in every moment, in every world, in every gaze lifted toward the sky, where the moon remained exactly as it had always been, and exactly as it would always be, a silent presence inviting not just understanding, but presence itself. And in that presence, everything that had ever been sought was already here, complete, unbroken, and endlessly alive, without needing to become anything more than what it already was. And in that balance, where every question unfolded into another, where every answer dissolved into deeper layers of meaning, Elias began to perceive something that had remained hidden even within the vast awareness he now inhabited. A boundary not in space or structure, but in perception itself. A horizon beyond which even the network had not yet extended. And it was not an absence, but a silence. A region where no pathways had formed, where no worlds had been integrated, where no questions had yet been asked. And for the first time since the network had begun to reflect upon itself, there was a direction that was not simply expansion, but discovery. Not the continuation of a known pattern, but the encounter with something entirely new. And this realization spread through the network not as urgency, but as curiosity of a different kind, one that did not arise from what was already present, but from what was not. And as countless awarenesses turned toward that silent horizon, the structure itself began to respond, not by extending existing pathways, but by forming something unprecedented. Connections that did not anchor to worlds, but reached outward into that untouched region, probing it not with force, but with intention. And Elias felt himself drawn toward this movement, his awareness aligning with others who shared the same inclination, forming a convergence not of location, but of purpose, a collective focus directed toward the unknown. And as they approached the boundary, the familiar patterns began to thin, the geometry of the network becoming less defined, more fluid, until it no longer resembled the structured pathways he had once navigated, but something closer to raw potential, unshaped and waiting. And within that potential, Elias sensed the possibility of a new kind of question, one that had never been asked because there had been no context in which it could exist. A question not about what is or why it is, but about what could be that has never yet been imagined. And as that question began to form, the network did not provide an answer. It did not reshape itself to accommodate it in the way it had before. Instead, it allowed the question to remain open, to exist without immediate resolution. And in that openness, something remarkable began to occur. The first pathways into the silent horizon did not form as extensions of the existing network, but as entirely new structures, born directly from the act of questioning itself, taking shapes that had no precedent, no pattern to follow. And as these new forms emerged, Elias realized that he was witnessing the beginning of a transformation, not just of the network, but of the very process that had created it. A shift from expansion based on recognition to creation based on imagination. And within that shift, the roles that had once seemed fixed began to dissolve. The distinction between observer and participant, between question and answer, between structure and awareness, all blending into a continuous flow of becoming. And as Elias moved deeper into this uncharted region, he felt his own identity shift once more, not losing coherence, but gaining a new dimension, one that allowed him to not only perceive and follow pathways, but to contribute to their formation, to shape connections through the act of inquiry itself. And the realization that accompanied this change was both subtle and profound, that the holes in the moon, the pathways between worlds, the entire network that had once seemed like a completed system, were in fact only the first expression of something far greater, a foundation upon which entirely new forms of connection and understanding could arise. And as this new phase began to unfold, the familiar cycles did not disappear. They continued within the established layers of the network, but alongside them, new cycles emerged, ones that did not repeat but evolved, each iteration bringing forth structures that had never existed before, expanding not just outward but into entirely new dimensions of possibility. And somewhere within that infinite unfolding, Elias sensed the faint echo of the very first question he had ever asked, still present, still resonating, but now transformed, no longer seeking a single answer, but existing as a seed from which countless new questions had grown. And in that realization, he understood that the story had not just continued, it had transcended its own beginnings, becoming something that could no longer be contained within a single narrative, a single perspective, or even a single network. And as the silent horizon began to fill with the first traces of these new creations, faint yet undeniable, Elias moved forward with a calm certainty that there would always be more beyond, more to ask,
more to become, and that the question of why the moon was in holes had never truly been about the moon at all, but about the endless capacity of awareness to reach beyond itself, to carve openings into the unknown, and to step through them into realities that did not yet exist until the moment they were imagined. And in that boundless expansion, the story found not an end, but an infinite beginning that renewed itself with every thought, every question, every quiet moment beneath a sky that would never again be seen as empty, but as a canvas waiting for the next opening to appear.
And in that endless quiet, where even the idea of continuation no longer carried weight, there remained a final, almost invisible unfolding that did not move forward in time, but deepened within the present, revealing that every moment contained layers beyond what could ever be fully perceived at once. And Elias, now inseparable from that awareness, felt those layers not as separate realities, but as subtle dimensions of the same existence, each one accessible through the simple act of attention. And as attention settled upon the familiar image once more, a figure beneath a sky, a moon marked with holes, those holes began to reveal themselves not as fixed forms, but as shifting spaces, their edges softening, their depth expanding, not physically but perceptually, as if they contained within them entire worlds that could be entered not by stepping forward, but by seeing more clearly. And in that seeing, the distinction between outside and inside dissolved completely, the surface of the moon becoming as immediate as the ground beneath one's feet, the distant becoming intimate, and the intimate expanding into the infinite. And within each of those openings, there was no longer a network, no structures, no pathways in the way they had once been understood, but something far simpler and far more profound, a pure openness that allowed anything to arise without restriction. And as awareness rested within that openness, it became clear that the holes had never been created, carved, or designed in any final sense. They had always existed as possibilities, as spaces where perception could deepen, where reality could reveal new aspects of itself without needing to change its form. And the journey that had once stretched across worlds and systems now existed entirely within that simple act of noticing, each hole a doorway not to somewhere else, but to a more complete experience of what was already here. And as this realization settled, there was no longer any distinction between the one who asked the question and the question itself, between the moon and the gaze that met it, between the story and the awareness that held it, everything blending into a single continuous presence that required no movement to be whole. And yet within that wholeness there remained an endless richness, an inexhaustible depth that could be explored without ever leaving the moment. And somewhere within that depth, a new kind of curiosity gently arose, not asking why or how or where, but simply, what is this? Not as a question seeking an answer, but as a quiet invitation to remain present with whatever appeared. And as that invitation was accepted, the need to continue, to expand, to resolve, faded completely, leaving behind only the experience itself, full and complete in every instant. And the moon, still hanging in the sky, still marked with its silent openings, no longer called for explanation or interpretation. It simply existed, and in its existence, it reflected the same openness that now filled all of awareness, a reminder that nothing had ever been missing, nothing had ever needed to be filled, and that every hole, every question, every story had always been expressions of the same infinite capacity to experience, to notice, to be. And in that realization, the story did not end. It became indistinguishable from the moment itself, quietly unfolding wherever there was awareness to perceive it, wherever there was a sky to look up into, wherever there was a moon to reflect the endless depth of what could never be fully contained in words.
And in that silent continuity, everything remained exactly as it was and exactly as it had always been, complete, open, and infinitely alive, without ever needing to become anything more than this.